A nation at the crossroads, the 1960s opened with the United States at the height of post-war prosperity. Suburbanization, industrial growth, and global influence positioned America as a superpower. Yet, beneath this optimism lay unresolved racial tensions, generational divides, anxieties over nuclear war, and social norms that no longer fit our rapidly changing society. The decade would become one of the most turbulent and transformative in American history. America in the 1960s, Revolution, Culture, and Crisis. America entered the 1960s standing at a crossroads, energized by post-war prosperity, yet burdened by unresolved tensions. It was a decade defined by extraordinary hope, profound conflict, and cultural transformation. What unfolded would reshape the nation's identity and alter the course of modern American history. The story begins in 1960 with the election of John F. Kennedy, whose youthful charisma and ambitious agenda promised a new era of leadership. Kennedy called his vision the New Frontier, a bold commitment to progress at home and strength abroad. His administration emphasized economic growth, federal investment in education, early civil rights initiatives, and an expanded role in the Cold War struggle. Americans watched with pride as the U.S. accelerated its space program, determined to surpass Soviet achievements and prove technological superiority. Yet beneath the optimism lay the deep anxieties of a nation facing unprecedented global pressure. The Cold War intensified quickly. Kennedy authorized the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, a failed attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro's regime in Cuba. The disaster embarrassed the United States and emboldened the Soviet Union. Later that year, tensions deepened when the Berlin Wall was erected, physically dividing East and West and symbolizing a world split between rival ideologies. But it was the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 that pushed the superpowers to the brink of nuclear war. For 13 days, the world held its breath as Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev navigated the most dangerous confrontation of the Cold War. Through careful negotiation, a peaceful resolution emerged, but the crisis changed American foreign policy and heightened public awareness of nuclear risk. In 1963, Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, shocking the nation and leaving a legacy of unfulfilled promise. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson assumed the presidency and moved swiftly to enact sweeping domestic reform. Johnson launched the Great Society, the most ambitious social program since the New Deal, through major legislation such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Medicare, Medicaid, and anti-poverty initiatives. Johnson aimed to eliminate racial injustice and economic inequality. Many of these programs permanently reshaped the U.S. social landscape. But Johnson's domestic success was overshadowed by the escalating Vietnam War. Although American involvement in Vietnam began earlier, the mid-1960s marked a dramatic increase in troops, funding, and military intensity. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1964 gave Johnson broad power to conduct war without a formal declaration. By 1968, more than 500,000 American troops were stationed in Vietnam. The conflict unfolded on television screens every night, bringing graphic images of combat and civilian suffering directly into American homes. As casualties mounted and victory appeared uncertain, public trust in government began to fracture. Opposition to the war fueled a massive anti-war movement. University campuses became centers of activism, where students organized teach-ins, peaceful demonstrations, and major protests. Groups like Students for a Democratic Society challenged traditional authority and demanded an end to the conflict. Draft resistance surged, and marches in Washington drew hundreds of thousands of participants. The anti-war movement soon evolved into part of a larger, youth-driven cultural revolution. At the same time, the civil rights movement entered its most transformative phase. African Americans fought to dismantle segregation, secure voting rights, and challenge systemic racism. Key moments included the Freedom Rides, the Birmingham Campaign, the March on Washington, and Martin Luther King Jr.'s iconic "I Have a Dream" speech in 1963. The Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act brought major legal victories, but progress remained slow and uneven. By the mid-1960s, frustration with police brutality, economic inequality, and broken promises gave rise to new expressions of Black empowerment. Malcolm X's message of self-determination inspired many, while the emergence of the Black Power movement and the Black Panther Party reflected a more militant response to ongoing injustice. Urban uprisings in Watts, Detroit, and Newark signaled a deepening divide between communities of color and the institutions that govern them. Women also mobilized to challenge traditional roles. The publication of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique in 1963 helped spark second-wave feminism, which emphasized equality in employment, education, and personal freedom. The National Organization for Women, founded in 1966, pushed for legal and cultural reform in a society where gender discrimination remained widespread. Other minority groups similarly sought justice. The Chicano movement fought for farm workers' rights and educational opportunity. Asian American activists organized for fair representation. Native American communities demanded sovereignty and drew national attention through landmark protests such as the occupation of Alcatraz Island in 1969. While social movements reshaped the nation's political landscape. The 1960s also witnessed a cultural revolution unlike anything seen before. Young Americans rejected traditional norms and embraced new forms of expression, identity, and lifestyle. Music became the heartbeat of the era. The Beatles transformed global culture. Bob Dylan revolutionized lyrical storytelling. And artists like Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin embodied the spirit of rebellion. The rise of psychedelic rock, experimental art, and countercultural literature reflected a generation searching for meaning in a rapidly changing world. The counterculture movement embraced alternative lifestyles, communal living, and expanded personal freedoms. The sexual revolution challenged long-standing taboos, while recreational drug use became more visible, symbolizing experimentation and defiance of conservative values. The decade's cultural climax arrived in 1969 with the Woodstock Music Festival, where hundreds of thousands gathered in a moment of unity, peace, and artistic expression. It was the peak of youth counterculture and a defining symbol of the era. Amid this cultural upheaval, America also achieved one of the greatest scientific milestones in human history. The space race, fueled by Cold War competition, reached its dramatic conclusion in 1969 when Apollo 11 landed on the moon. Neil Armstrong's words, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," echoed around the world and demonstrated the extraordinary potential of American innovation. The moon landing became both a technological triumph and a moment of national pride, offering inspiration during a decade marked by turmoil. Yet the optimism of scientific achievement could not overshadow the crises of 1968, one of the most turbulent years in American history. The Tet Offensive in Vietnam shattered the illusion that victory was near. The assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy devastated the country and intensified political polarization. Nationwide unrest and violent clashes erupted in dozens of cities. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago turned into chaos as protesters and police collided in front of television cameras. Many Americans felt the nation was coming apart. The election of Richard Nixon later that year marked a shift in political direction. Nixon appealed to the so-called silent majority, Americans who were troubled by social unrest and cultural change. His message of law and order reflected growing concerns about crime, protest, and national identity. The decade closed with the country deeply divided over war, race, culture, and the future of American society. Looking back, the 1960s transformed the United States more profoundly than almost any decade in modern history. It produced major civil rights advancements, redefined gender and cultural norms, altered political alignments, and accelerated scientific progress. At the same time, it exposed deep fractures that would continue to shape American politics and social life for generations. The legacy of the 1960s lives on in its movements, its music, its conflicts, and its dreams. It remains a decade of revolution, culture, and crisis, one that reshaped the American story and forever changed what the nation believed itself to be. The early 1960s marked one of the most dangerous periods in modern global history, a time when the United States and the Soviet Union pushed the Cold War into new and unpredictable territory. With both nations locked into a struggle for ideological, political, and military dominance, the stakes had never been higher. Every decision carried the risk of miscalculation. Every confrontation had the potential to escalate into nuclear war. America, under President John F. Kennedy, stepped into this decade with promises of youthful energy, bold leadership, and a renewed commitment to global strategy. But the challenges that lay ahead would test the limits of diplomacy, the resilience of the American people, and the stability of a world divided between two superpowers. The first major crisis came quickly. In 1961, the United States launched the Bay of Pigs invasion, a covert operation designed to overthrow Fidel Castro's communist government in Cuba. The plan, inherited by Kennedy from the Eisenhower administration, relied on training Cuban exiles to ignite a popular uprising. But from the beginning, the operation suffered from poor intelligence, inadequate planning, and flawed assumptions. When the invasion began, Castro's forces crushed the attackers within days. The world watched as the United States faced a humiliating failure. The defeat damaged America's global credibility and hardened Castro's alignment with the Soviet Union. Kennedy publicly accepted responsibility, but privately he was shaken, and the miscalculation would shape his approach to foreign policy moving forward. Only months later, the Cold War confrontation intensified again, this time in the heart of Europe. In August 1961, the Soviet-backed East German government constructed the Berlin Wall, sealing off West Berlin from the surrounding communist territory. The sudden appearance of barbed wire, concrete barriers, and armed guards shocked the world. Berlin, already a symbol of Cold War tension, became the physical representation of ideological division, democracy on one side, authoritarian communism on the other. Families were separated overnight, escape attempts turned deadly, and the wall stood as a constant reminder of the world's fractured political landscape. For the United States, Berlin was a critical, strategic, and symbolic battleground. Kennedy responded with a firm stance, reinforcing the American presence in West Berlin and delivering his famous declaration that the city represented the front line of freedom. The United States would not abandon the people of Berlin. The message was clear. American resolve remained unbroken. But the most dangerous confrontation was yet to come. In October 1962, the Cold War reached its most perilous moment during what would become known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. American reconnaissance flights discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba, just 90 miles from the Florida coastline. Their presence posed an immediate threat to national security, with the potential to strike major American cities within minutes. The discovery stunned the Kennedy administration and set off a tense 13-day standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union. The world entered a state of unprecedented fear. For nearly 2 weeks, the globe hovered at the edge of nuclear catastrophe. Inside the White House, Kennedy convened a group of top military intelligence and diplomatic advisors known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM. Opinions varied sharply. Some advisors pushed for airstrikes and a full-scale invasion of Cuba. Others urged caution, warning that aggressive action could spark a wider conflict or provoke a nuclear response from the Soviets. Kennedy ultimately chose a different path. He announced a naval quarantine of Cuba, stopping Soviet ships from delivering additional weapons. It was a strategic middle ground, strong enough to signal resolve, but restrained enough to allow room for negotiation. As American warships took their positions, the world watched in suspense as Soviet vessels approached the quarantine line. Any misstep could trigger irreversible escalation. Publicly, the crisis unfolded through televised speeches, newspaper headlines, and anxious conversations in homes, schools, and workplaces across America. Children practiced duck-and-cover drills. Families quietly prepared for the unimaginable. The fear of nuclear war permeated daily life. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, a secret diplomatic channel was working to de-escalate the situation. Through a series of urgent messages, Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev sought a peaceful resolution. Ultimately, diplomacy prevailed. The Soviet Union agreed to remove its missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade the island. In a secret side agreement, the United States also promised to withdraw obsolete Jupiter missiles from Turkey, which bordered the Soviet Union. The standoff ended without war, but the crisis left lasting consequences. Both nations recognized the need for clearer communication and more responsible management of nuclear weapons. In the months that followed, the two superpowers established a direct hotline between Washington and Moscow to reduce the risk of future misunderstandings. The crisis also paved the way for the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, a major step toward limiting the spread and testing of nuclear weapons. For the United States, the Cuban Missile Crisis became a defining moment of leadership. Kennedy emerged with strengthened credibility at home and abroad. His calm, measured handling of the situation was praised as a triumph of diplomacy over aggression. Yet the crisis also revealed the fragility of global stability. One misjudged order or poorly interpreted signal could have changed the course of history. The world had come closer to nuclear war than ever before, and the memory of those tense days left a permanent mark on public consciousness. The events of the early 1960s Bay of Pigs, the Berlin Wall, and the Cuban Missile Crisis reshaped America's Cold War strategy. These confrontations forced leaders to reconsider assumptions about military power, alliance politics, and the limits of intervention. They also shaped the future of American foreign policy, influencing decisions throughout the rest of the decade and beyond. As the United States continued to confront global challenges from Vietnam to shifting geopolitical alliances, the lessons of the early 1960s remained central to the nation's approach. The Cold War was not simply a geopolitical rivalry, it was a test of endurance, ideology, and diplomacy. And in the early years of the 1960s, the United States faced some of the most dangerous challenges of that struggle. Through missteps, crises, and breakthroughs, America navigated a world where peace was never guaranteed and the future felt uncertain. But it was precisely through these trials that the nation discovered its capacity for resilience, strategic leadership, and the difficult balance between military strength and diplomatic restraint. The legacy of this era endures as a reminder of how close the world came to disaster and how essential wise decision-making became in preserving global stability. The 1960s in America was a decade of extraordinary transformation, a collision of hope, fear, conflict, and creativity that reshaped the nation's identity. This was a time when social movements erupted, political ideals were challenged, cultural norms were rewritten, and the United States found itself confronting its greatest promises and deepest contradictions. From civil rights to Vietnam, from counterculture to political assassinations, the 1960s marked an era of revolution, culture, and crisis. Our story begins on January 20th, 1961, when a young and charismatic president, John F. Kennedy, took the oath of office. In his inaugural address, he called on Americans to ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. For millions, Kennedy symbolized a new generation of leadership, confident and forward-looking. His administration promoted scientific innovation, civil rights progress, and the bold ambition to send a man to the moon before the decade's end. But early optimism soon collided with harsh geopolitical realities. The Cold War was intensifying. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 was followed by the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. bringing the world closer to nuclear war than ever before. Kennedy managed to avoid catastrophe, but the shock of the moment left Americans aware that global peace rested on a razor's edge. At home, another confrontation was growing: the long struggle over civil rights. African Americans in the South lived under segregation, and activists mobilized to challenge the nation's broken promises of equality. Sit-ins, freedom rides, and marches demanded racial justice in the face of violent resistance. Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. emerged as a national voice for nonviolent protest. The 1963 March on Washington, where King delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech, became a turning point in the national consciousness. Yet, even as hope rose, tragedy struck. On November 22, 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The nation was stunned, grief-stricken, and unsure of its direction. The presidency passed to Lyndon B. Johnson, a master legislator who set out to complete the projects Kennedy had begun. Under Johnson, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, two monumental laws that outlawed segregation and protected the right to vote. Johnson also launched the Great Society, an ambitious program aimed at ending poverty, expanding education, protecting the environment, and providing health care to the elderly and poor through Medicare and Medicaid. For a brief period, the federal government seemed capable of reshaping society on a grand scale. But Johnson's achievements were overshadowed by the escalating conflict in Vietnam. The United States had been involved in Vietnam since the 1950s, but by the mid-1960s, it became a full-scale war. American troops were deployed in increasing numbers, fighting a difficult and controversial conflict far from home. Television brought images of the war into living rooms across America, villages burning, soldiers wounded, and casualties rising. Public trust in government began to erode as officials insisted victory was near, even as the reality on the ground showed otherwise. Anti-war protests swept the country, especially among college students. The Vietnam War became a symbol of national division, fueling anger, frustration, and a growing counterculture movement that rejected traditional values. At the same time, the civil rights movement continued to evolve. After the victories of 1964 and 1965, activists pushed for deeper structural changes. Urban unrest broke out in major cities, driven by poverty, discrimination, and the frustration of slow progress. New voices emerged, including Malcolm X and groups such as the Black Panther Party, who argued for Black empowerment and self-defense. The nation was wrestling with the meaning of equality, citizenship, and justice. Meanwhile, young Americans were forging a cultural revolution. Music, art, and lifestyle transformed dramatically. Rock and roll exploded with artists like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Jimi Hendrix, and Bob Dylan shaping a generation's identity. The counterculture embraced freedom, experimentation, and a rejection of rigid social norms. Communal living, psychedelic art, and a new wave of political expression created an atmosphere of radical change. Nowhere was this energy more visible than in 1967's Summer of Love in San Francisco, where tens of thousands gathered to explore new cultural frontiers. The climax came in 1969 at the Woodstock Music Festival, 3 days of music, peace, and community that became a symbol of the era's spirit. But the decade's optimism was continually challenged by violence and loss. In 1968, the Tet Offensive shattered the illusion that victory in Vietnam was close. American confidence in leadership collapsed. That same year, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, prompting riots in more than 100 cities. Only months later, Robert F. Kennedy, the brother of the slain president and a leading voice for unity, was also assassinated. The nation seemed on the brink of chaos. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago erupted in violent clashes between police and anti-war demonstrators, broadcast on national television for the world to see. In November of 1968, Richard Nixon was elected president, promising law and order and an end to the war. His victory reflected a shift in the country, as many Americans grew weary of protest movements and social upheaval. The decade closed with the moon landing in July 1969's fulfilling Kennedy's dream and offering, a moment of triumph and unity in a turbulent era. But beneath that achievement lay the unresolved tensions that would continue into the 1970s and beyond. The 1960s had changed America forever. It was a decade of dramatic transformation. Civil rights breakthroughs, youth rebellion, political assassinations, and a war that tore the nation apart. It was a period of immense creativity and profound division, of idealism matched against violence, and of a nation struggling to redefine itself. The legacy of the 1960s remains visible in modern debates over race, politics, culture, and national identity. It was, in every sense, a revolution, one that reshaped American society and continues to influence the country today. And so, as we look back on this turbulent decade, we see a nation in transition, confronting its past, questioning its institutions, and forging new pathways forward. The 1960s were not merely a chapter in history, they were a turning point, a moment when America struggled, transformed, and emerged forever changed. The story of America in the 1960s is a story of revolution, culture, and crisis, a decade defined by rising hope, fierce conflict, and a collision between old values and new visions of the future. Over 10 extraordinary years, the United States confronted civil rights battles, global tensions, social upheaval, political assassinations, cultural reinvention, and a war that divided the nation like never before. Our journey begins with the inauguration of John F. Kennedy in January 1961. Young, charismatic, and confident, Kennedy symbolized a new generation of leadership. He urged Americans to join him in shaping a brighter future, declaring, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." His administration emphasized scientific progress, civil rights advancement, and the ambitious promise to land a man on the moon before the decade ended. But as Kennedy pushed forward, the weight of Cold War tensions pressed heavily on the nation. The early 1960s brought confrontations with the Soviet Union that pushed the world to the edge of nuclear war. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 revealed the dangers of global power struggles. Then, in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis shocked Americans as photographs revealed. Soviet nuclear missiles pointed directly at the United States. For days, the world held its breath. Kennedy's negotiations ultimately averted catastrophe, but the crisis left a deep reminder of how fragile peace truly was. At home, another battle was unfolding, this one for justice. African Americans living under segregation in the South organized to challenge long-standing racial inequality. Sit-ins, freedom rides, marches, and voter registration campaigns grew into a national movement. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as a central voice for nonviolent protest, urging America to confront its promises of freedom and equality. The March on Washington in 1963 brought hundreds of thousands to the nation's capital, where King delivered his historic "I Have a Dream" speech. But hope was again met by tragedy. On November 22, 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The nation mourned a young leader whose influence had only begun to take shape. Lyndon B. Johnson assumed the presidency, determined to push forward the work Kennedy had started. Johnson used his political skill to pass some of the most important legislation in American history. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed segregation and discrimination. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 protected Black Americans' right to vote. Johnson then introduced the Great Society, an ambitious agenda to eliminate poverty, expand education, protect the environment, and create Medicare and Medicaid. With these achievements, the federal government reached deeper into American life than ever before. But as Johnson built the Great Society, a powerful storm was gathering overseas. America's involvement in Vietnam had begun in the 1950s, but after 1964, it accelerated rapidly. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution granted President Johnson broad military authority, and the United States launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a massive bombing campaign against North Vietnam. Soon, hundreds of thousands of American troops were sent into combat. By the late 1960s, more than 500,000 troops were fighting in a war with no clear end in sight. For the first time in history, television brought the brutality of war directly into American homes. Families watched nightly news broadcasts showing firefights, bombings, and military casualties. As the reality of the conflict became impossible to ignore, public support began to crumble. Young Americans questioned why they were being drafted to fight a distant war that seemed unwinnable. Protests spread across college campuses, and the anti-war movement grew into one of the most powerful social forces of the decade. Meanwhile, the civil rights movement entered a new and turbulent phase. Although crucial legislation had passed, structural inequalities persisted. Urban unrest erupted in cities including Los Angeles, Detroit, Newark, and Washington, driven by anger over poverty, discrimination, and systemic neglect. New leaders and organizations emerged, ranging from Malcolm X's call for Black empowerment to the Black Panther Party's demands for community self-defense and political representation. The unity of earlier protests gave way to a broader, more complex struggle for justice. While the nation wrestled with war and civil rights, young Americans sparked a cultural revolution. The rise of rock and roll, psychedelic art, political expression, and new lifestyles shaped a counterculture movement that openly rejected traditional norms. Music icons like the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Bob Dylan became the soundtracks of social transformation. The 1967 Summer of Love in San Francisco introduced new ideas about spirituality, creativity, and community. The counterculture reached its peak in 1969 at Woodstock, where hundreds of thousands gathered for 3 days of music and unity that became a defining symbol of the era. But beneath the era's innovation and hope, the country was unraveling. In January 1968, the Vietnam War transformed again with the Tet Offensive, a massive surprise attack by North Vietnamese forces. Although the United States ultimately repelled the assault, the scale of the attack shattered public belief that victory was near. Confidence in the government's honesty collapsed, fueling even greater opposition to the war. Then tragedy struck at home. On April 4, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis. Riots erupted in more than 100 American cities as grief turned to fury. Only 2 months later, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, who had become a powerful voice for unity and justice, was also assassinated after winning the California Democratic primary. The nation felt as if it were coming apart. The political climate reached its boiling point at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, where massive anti-war protests clashed with police in scenes broadcast across the world. Tear gas filled the streets. Demonstrators were beaten and dragged away. The violent chaos crystallized America's divisions. In November 1968, Richard Nixon was elected president, promising to restore law and order and bring an honorable end to the war in Vietnam. His victory signaled a shift in public mood. Many Americans were exhausted by protest movements, social upheaval, and national instability. The decade ended with a symbolic triumph. On July 20, 1969, the United States achieved the goal Kennedy had set years earlier, landing a man on the moon. As Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface and declared, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," Americans looked on with pride. The moon landing provided a rare moment of unity at a time when the nation was deeply divided. Yet, despite that historic achievement, the unresolved struggles of the decade remained. Racial inequality, political distrust, generational conflict, and the lasting wounds of Vietnam. The 1960s had transformed America's identity. challenged its institutions, and forced the nation to confront its contradictions. Looking back, the decade stands as one of the most consequential in American history. It was a period of hope and heartbreak, innovation and unrest, progress and resistance. The movements, ideas, and challenges of the 1960s continue to influence the United States. Today, shaping conversations about civil rights, democracy, culture, and national purpose. This was America in the 1960s, a nation in turmoil, a society redefining itself, and a generation determined to challenge the past and build a new future. A decade of revolution, culture, and crisis forever changing the story of America. The 1960s was one of the most turbulent decades in American history, a period defined by bold dreams, deep conflicts, and dramatic transformations. Over 10 unforgettable years, the United States confronted civil rights struggles, cultural revolutions, political assassinations, global tensions, and a war that fractured the nation. This is the story of America in the 1960s: revolution, culture, and crisis. Our journey begins in 1961 with the inauguration of John F. Kennedy. Young, charismatic, and full of optimism, Kennedy represented a new era of possibility. His call for public service inspired millions, and his agenda focused on scientific progress, social reform, and global leadership. He challenged America to reach the moon before the decade's end, a promise that would later define the nation's technological ambitions. But Kennedy's presidency unfolded under the looming shadow of the Cold War. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 exposed the dangers of confronting communism abroad. A year later, the Cuban Missile Crisis pushed the world to the brink of nuclear conflict. For 13 tense days, Americans lived under the fear of annihilation. Kennedy's ability to negotiate a peaceful resolution was widely praised, but the crisis underscored how fragile peace truly was. As international tensions simmered, a different battle was being fought on American soil. The civil rights movement surged forward as African Americans organized against segregation and systemic injustice. Sit-ins, freedom rides, marches, and grassroots organizing spread across the South. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as the prominent voice for nonviolent resistance. His leadership and moral clarity galvanized the nation, culminating in the historic 1963 March on Washington, where he delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. But the country's hope was shaken on November 22, 1963, when President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The nation mourned the loss of a leader whose vision had only begun to take shape. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson assumed the presidency, determined to continue Kennedy's work. Johnson moved swiftly, using his political experience to pass groundbreaking legislation: the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 dismantled legalized segregation and protected the voting rights of Black Americans. Johnson then introduced the Great Society program, an ambitious plan to reduce poverty, expand education, improve healthcare, and protect the environment. Medicare, Medicaid, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and new poverty initiatives transformed American social policy. Yet even as Johnson pursued reform at home, the United States became increasingly entangled in conflict abroad. Vietnam had been simmering since the 1950s, but after the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, U.S. involvement escalated dramatically. Johnson ordered a massive bombing campaign operation, Rolling Thunder, and deployed hundreds of thousands of American troops. By the late 1960s, more than 500,000 Americans were fighting a war that seemed directionless and unwinnable. This was the first war brought directly into American living rooms. Televised images showed firefights, burning villages, and soldiers in body bags. The stark contrast between official reports of progress and the grim reality seen on the nightly news shattered public trust. As casualties mounted, young Americans began to question not just the war, but the government itself. This rising dissent fed directly into one of the most defining forces of the decade: the anti-war and counterculture movements. By the mid-1960s, anti-war sentiment energized students, intellectuals, artists, and everyday citizens. Student groups like Students for a Democratic Society, known as SDS, led large demonstrations calling for peace and political transparency. Teach-ins across college campuses offered open forums to debate the morality and strategy of the war. Draft resistance spread rapidly, with many young men burning their draft cards or seeking refuge in Canada to avoid conscription. The March on the Pentagon in 1967 was one of the most iconic acts of protest, drawing tens of thousands of demonstrators. Protesters confronted soldiers, chanted against the war, and demanded accountability from political leaders. Over time, the anti-war movement merged with a broader cultural rebellion, rejection of traditional social norms, and a search for new values. This was the rise of the counterculture. Young Americans experimented with alternative lifestyles, communal living, new forms of spirituality, and artistic expression. Rock music became the voice of a generation. The Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Bob Dylan shaped a cultural identity centered on peace, liberation, and individual freedom. Psychedelic art, experimental fashion, and political activism blended into a movement that challenged the very foundations of American society. The counterculture reached its peak at Woodstock in 1969. For 3 days, 500,000 people gathered in New York for music, unity, and collective celebration. Despite rain, mud, and logistical chaos, Woodstock became an enduring symbol of peace and youthful idealism. But while the counterculture flourished, racial tensions escalated. Despite major legislative victories, Black Americans continued to face systemic poverty, discrimination, and violence. Between 1965 and 1968, many cities including Los Angeles, Detroit, and Newark erupted in riots, each fueled by frustration with unequal treatment and limited economic opportunity. New leaders emerged, such as Malcolm X and the Black Panther Party, who argued for self-determination, community control, and protection from police violence. The civil rights movement evolved from a unified campaign for integration into a broader and more complex struggle. The year 1968 marked a turning point, perhaps the darkest moment of the decade. In January, the Tet Offensive shattered the illusion of American progress in Vietnam. Although U.S. forces ultimately held their ground, the size and coordination of the attack exposed the government's misleading claims about the war. Public confidence collapsed. Then, tragedy struck again. On April 4, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis. His death unleashed grief and rage across the country, sparking riots in more than 100 cities. 2 months later, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, one of the nation's strongest advocates for unity and justice, was assassinated after winning the California Democratic primary. As summer gave way to fall, political tensions reached a boiling point at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Outside the convention hall, thousands of anti-war demonstrators clashed violently with police. Television cameras broadcast images of tear gas, beatings, and mass arrest scenes that captured a nation at war with itself. In November 1968, Richard Nixon won the presidency on a campaign promising law and order and a plan to end the Vietnam War. His election marked a shift in the political landscape, as many Americans sought stability after a decade of upheaval. Despite the turmoil, the decade ended with a moment of triumph. On July 20, 1969, the United States achieved Kennedy's long-standing promise, landing a man on the moon. When Neil Armstrong set foot on the lunar surface and declared, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," Americans looked on with pride. For one brief moment, the nation united in awe at what human determination and innovation could accomplish. And yet, the conflicts of the 1960s did not simply fade away. The decade left deep wounds, racial inequalities that persisted, political distrust that lingered, cultural shifts that continued to redefine American identity, and a war that would extend into the 1970s. But the 1960s also left behind extraordinary achievements and new possibilities. The civil rights movement reshaped the moral foundation of the nation. The youth culture reimagined creativity, music, and personal freedom. Social movements expanded the boundaries of political participation. And the moon landing demonstrated that even in a divided era, Americans could still accomplish the extraordinary. Looking back, the 1960s stand as one of the most transformative decades in American history at a time, when the country confronted its own contradictions and wrestled with the meaning of democracy, equality, and national purpose. 'Twas a decade of tension and triumph, conflict and creativity, hope and heartbreak. A decade that forever changed the story of America. This was America in the 1960s: revolution, culture, and crisis. A decade that shaped the modern world and continues to influence the nation we live in today. By the mid-1960s, America was undergoing a profound cultural shift. Young people rejected traditional norms and pushed for new ways of thinking, living, and expressing themselves. Music, art, fashion, and lifestyle experimentation became signatures of a new cultural identity. But the heart of the social revolution was the ongoing fight for racial equality. The civil rights movement's new phase. The struggle against racial injustice defined much of the 1960s. Key victories had changed. The legal landscape, sit-ins, and freedom rides challenged segregation. The March on Washington amplified demands for equality. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 protected Black Americans' voting rights, but legal change did not erase centuries of inequality. By the late 1960s, frustration grew over slow progress, police brutality, and economic injustice. A new phase of the movement began. Malcolm X's sharp critique of America's racial system gained national attention. His message of Black pride, self-determination, and community control resonated with many who felt nonviolence alone was not enough. After his assassination in 1965, his ideas continued to shape the movement. Groups like the Black Panther Party emerged, demanding protection from police violence and advocating social programs such as community health clinics and free breakfast initiatives. Urban uprisings erupted in cities including Watts, Detroit, and Newark, fueled by anger over discrimination, unemployment, and systemic neglect. The civil rights movement was no longer a unified campaign centered on nonviolence. It had become a broad, diverse struggle for justice, identity, and power. It was a turning point in the national conversation about race, equality, and the meaning of American democracy. As the fight for justice intensified, the counterculture blossomed. Rock music became the pulse of a generation. The Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Bob Dylan shaped the soundtrack of change. Psychedelic art and experimentation reflected a desire for liberation and expanded consciousness. Communal living, spiritual exploration, and political activism blended into a unique cultural identity. The counterculture reached its peak in 1969 at Woodstock, where nearly 500,000 people gathered for 3 days of music, peace, and unity. Despite rain, mud, and chaotic logistics, Woodstock became a symbol of youthful idealism and cultural transformation. But while cultural revolution flourished, 1968 became one of the most devastating years in American history. The Tet Offensive, a massive coordinated attack by North Vietnamese force, shocked the nation. Although U.S. troops eventually pushed back the offensive, the psychological impact was enormous. Americans realized the war was far from over. Public trust in government reached a breaking point. On April 4, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis. His death sparked riots in more than 100 cities as grief turned to rage. 2 months later, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, rising voice for unity, was assassinated after winning the California Democratic primary. The country seemed to be unraveling. Tensions exploded at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, where thousands of protesters confronted police in violent clashes broadcast on national television. Images of tear gas, club-wielding officers, and terrified demonstrators revealed a nation deeply divided. Richard Nixon won the 1968 presidential election, promising law and order and a plan to end the war in Vietnam. His victory signaled a shift toward political conservatism, as many Americans yearned for stability after a decade of upheaval. Despite the turmoil, the decade ended with a moment of triumph. On July 20, 1969, the United States fulfilled Kennedy's challenge by landing astronauts on the moon. Neil Armstrong's first step marked not only a technological miracle, but also a rare moment of unity for a divided nation. Yet the struggles of the 1960s did not disappear. Racial inequality persisted. Political distrust deepened. Cultural polarization widened. And the wounds of Vietnam continued into the next decade. But the achievements of the era civil rights victories, expanded opportunities, artistic innovation, and social transformation left an enduring mark. The 1960s forced America to confront its contradictions and reimagine its identity. This was America in the 1960s, a decade of revolution, culture, and crisis. A time of conflict and creativity, tragedy and triumph. A decade that reshaped the nation and continues to define the American story today. The 1960s in America was a decade defined by turbulence, transformation, and profound cultural change. It was a time when the nation confronted its deepest contradictions, reimagined its moral boundaries, and reshaped its identity on the world stage. This is the story of a society under pressure, stretching, breaking, and rebuilding itself in the face of revolution, culture, and crisis. As the decade began, the optimism of a new era swept across the nation. The election of John F. Kennedy in 1960 symbolized youth, energy, and ambition. His administration, later remembered as Camelot, promised progress, innovation, and a renewed sense of national purpose. Kennedy's call for Americans to ask what you can do for your country inspired a generation to believe in public service, global leadership, and collective responsibility. His support for the space program ignited a national dream that the United States could reach the moon before the decade closed. But beneath this idealism lay fractures that would soon widen. The civil rights struggle, already decades old, surged into national consciousness. African Americans in the South lived under segregation enforced by law, violence, and intimidation. In 1960, 4 black college students staged a sit-in at a Woolworth lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, sparking a wave of peaceful protests across the country. Young activists formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee's (NCC), powerful new force for grassroots change. By 1963, the movement gained unprecedented momentum. That spring, the nation watched televised images of police in Birmingham unleashing dogs and fire hoses on peaceful marchers, spread far beyond the South. Later that year, over 250,000 people gathered in Washington, D.C., for one of the largest demonstrations in American history. There, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his immortal "I Have a Dream" speech, capturing both the pain of the moment and the hope for a more just future. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 would become landmark victories, dismantling legal segregation and protecting the right to vote. Yet even these triumphs could not erase decades of inequality, nor could they calm every community's frustration. In the middle of this transformation, tragedy struck the nation. On November 22, 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. The shocking event plunged the United States into grief and uncertainty. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson assumed the presidency and immediately pushed forward Kennedy's unfinished agenda. Johnson launched the Great Society, an ambitious series of programs aimed at ending poverty, expanding education, improving healthcare, and advancing civil rights. Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start, and the War on Poverty reshaped the federal government's role in American life. But as Johnson battled for reforms at home, his attention was increasingly pulled overseas. The Vietnam War, which began as a modest advisory mission, escalated rapidly under Johnson. Convinced that stopping communism in Southeast Asia was essential to global stability, the administration poured troops, money, and military resources into the conflict. By the mid-1960s, hundreds of thousands of American soldiers were fighting in dense jungles against a determined enemy. As casualties mounted and victory remained elusive, public support eroded. Televised combat footage brought the war into living rooms across America, exposing the brutal reality of a conflict that seemed to have no clear purpose or end. The growing anti-war movement united students, intellectuals, veterans, and activists in a broad demand for peace. Massive demonstrations erupted on college campuses and in major cities. Organizations like Students for a Democratic Society criticized government policies and called for political transparency. The draft became a symbol of national controversy, pushing many young men to resist, protest. The 1960s in America was a decade defined by struggle, reinvention, and profound cultural transformation. It was an era in which old systems were confronted and new movements reshaped the national identity. Across the country, communities mobilized to challenge institutional injustice, reclaim cultural dignity, and demand equal treatment under the law. This is the story of a nation undergoing social revolution, political upheaval, and cultural awakening. As the decade opened, the United States projected confidence and optimism. The election of John F. Kennedy offered a sense of renewal and possibility. His administration symbolized youthful energy, a forward-looking vision, and a promise of reform. Kennedy called Americans to service, encouraging action not only at home but across the globe. He committed the nation to landing a man on the moon before 1970, setting a bold technological and scientific goal that captured the imagination of millions. Yet beneath the surface, America was fracturing. The civil rights movement surged into national prominence as African Americans fought to dismantle segregation. Sit-ins, freedom rides, marches, and nonviolent protests confronted deeply rooted racism. Televised images of police violence against peaceful demonstrators in cities such as Birmingham shocked the country and intensified public pressure for reform. In 1963, the March on Washington became a defining moment in American history, where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 followed, outlawing legal segregation and protecting voting rights. These legislative wins marked major turning points, but the struggle for genuine equality continued nationwide. During this upheaval, the nation was shaken by the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963. The tragedy halted the momentum of Camelot and thrust Lyndon B. Johnson into the presidency. Johnson expanded the federal role in social policy through the Great Society program, tackling poverty, education, healthcare, and civil rights. Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start, and food assistance programs redefined the federal government's obligations to its citizens. But the success of these domestic reforms was overshadowed by the escalating war in Vietnam. The Vietnam War, initially justified by Cold War logic, grew into a massive and controversial conflict. By the mid-1960s, hundreds of thousands of American troops were deployed. Nightly television broadcasts revealed the brutality of jungle warfare, contradicting government assurances and fueling widespread anger. The anti-war movement expanded rapidly, uniting students, veterans, clergy, and activists. Demonstrations swept across universities and major cities. Draft resistance intensified as the human cost of the war became undeniable. The conflict divided families, political leaders, and communities, leaving deep scars that would last for generations. At the same time, the youth counterculture challenged conventional norms about identity, authority, and lifestyle. Young Americans rejected traditional social expectations, turning instead toward communal living. New music, expressive fashion, and alternative values. Rock and folk music became the soundtrack of rebellion, while festivals such as Woodstock symbolized a generational break from the past. Psychedelic art, experimental literature, and a growing emphasis on personal freedom reshaped cultural landscapes. The counterculture pushed society to reconsider its assumptions about gender roles, sexuality, mental health, spirituality, and the boundaries of expression. The feminist movement also gained momentum during this era, inspired by the publication of The Feminine Mystique and rising frustrations around limited opportunities. Women challenged expectations that confined them to domestic life. Activists advocated for workplace protections, educational equality, reproductive rights, and representation. The creation of the National Organization for Women in 1966 solidified second-wave feminism as a national force. Women demanded access to power, autonomy, and full participation in public life, laying the groundwork for lasting social change. In addition to African American activism and feminism, other marginalized groups launched their own powerful movements. Chicano activists, particularly in the Southwest and California, fought for labor rights, educational equality, political representation, and cultural recognition. The United Farm Workers, led by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, organized groundbreaking labor strikes and boycotts to secure better wages and working conditions for farm workers. Their peaceful protests and nationwide grape boycott brought attention to the exploitation of agricultural laborers and demonstrated the power of collective action. Chicano students organized walkouts to demand equitable schooling, bilingual education, and an end to discriminatory practices. Across the country, the Chicano movement reinforced cultural pride and community empowerment. Asian American activists also mobilized in the late 1960s, forming political coalitions to challenge unfair housing practices, employment discrimination, and racist stereotypes. Inspired by the broader civil rights environment, Asian American students and community organizations fought for ethnic studies programs, social services, and civil liberties. Their activism marked a turning point, uniting diverse groups, Chinese, Filipino, Korean, and others under a shared political identity. These efforts helped define the modern Asian American movement and established a collective voice demanding visibility and justice. Native American communities likewise intensified their calls for sovereignty, cultural recognition, and treaty rights. Decades of federal mistreatment, forced relocation, and broken agreements fueled a new era of Native activism. In 1968, the American Indian movement formed to address police brutality, poverty, and systemic discrimination. In 1969, Native activists staged the occupation of Alcatraz Island, asserting that abandoned federal land should return to Native hands under the terms of historic treaties. The occupation captured national attention and symbolized a broader demand for dignity, self-determination, and historical recognition. These movements challenged long-standing injustices and reasserted Native voices in the national narrative. Even as social movements flourished, the nation faced continued turbulence. Urban riots erupted in major cities, reflecting deep frustrations around poverty, inequality, and police violence. The assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 devastated millions and ignited widespread grief and unrest. Just 2 months later, Senator Robert Kennedy, who had emerged as a powerful anti-war figure and advocate for civil rights, was also assassinated. These tragedies intensified a sense of national crisis and fueled questions about the country's moral direction. That same year, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago erupted into televised chaos. Anti-war protesters clashed with police in violent confrontations that shocked viewers across the nation. Political polarization reached new heights as Americans grappled with the feeling that their society was spinning out of control. In the 1968 presidential election, Richard Nixon capitalized on this unrest, promising law and order, a reduction in social conflict, and an honorable end to the Vietnam War. His victory signaled the beginning of a new political era, closing the chapter on a decade defined by progressive activism and sweeping reforms. Yet amid the turmoil, extraordinary achievements reshaped the future. The space race reached its apex on July 20, 1969, when astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the Moon. Millions watched as Armstrong took humanity's first steps on another world. The lunar landing stood as a symbol of American innovation, ambition, and unity, a moment of collective pride during a time of division. By the end of the decade, the United States had undergone cultural and political transformation on an unprecedented scale. Civil rights activism had dismantled segregation and expanded democratic participation. Anti-war demonstrations reshaped foreign policy debates. Chicano, Asian American, and Native American movements reclaimed cultural identity and demanded justice. The counterculture revolution redefined music, art, and social norms. Feminism challenged entrenched gender roles. The moon landing showed what bold national ambition could achieve. The 1960s was a crucible, intense, chaotic, and transformative, out of which emerged a more diverse, more self-aware, and more contested vision of America. The decade's conflicts were fierce, and its victories were hard-won. But its legacy remains one of resilience, activism, and the belief that change is both possible and necessary. The movements that rose in the 1960s forever altered the American consciousness, laying the foundation for future struggles and achievements. In its triumphs and its tragedies, its courage and its conflict, the 1960s reshaped the nation's identity and defined what America would become in the generations ahead. The 1960s in America was a decade defined by upheaval, reinvention, and a profound reshaping of national identity. It was a time when the country confronted its deepest inequalities, challenged long-standing cultural norms, and pushed the boundaries of science, politics, and imagination. As the decade opened, a sense of optimism filled the air. John F. Kennedy's election brought youth, energy, and promise to the White House. His speeches called on Americans to pursue public service, scientific advancement, and a renewed sense of national purpose. This spirit of ambition crystallized in the Apollo program, with the bold promise to land a man on the moon before the decade ended. But while the Kennedy era symbolized hope, America was already simmering with unresolved tensions. The civil rights movement surged forward, challenging centuries of racial segregation and discrimination. Across the South, African Americans organized sit-ins, boycotts, and marches. The televised violence in Birmingham, where peaceful protesters were attacked by police dogs and fire hoses, shocked the nation and forced Americans to confront the brutality of Jim Crow. In 1963, the March on Washington gathered hundreds of thousands of people demanding federal action. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his unforgettable "I Have a Dream" speech, voicing both the anguish and the aspirations of millions. The following years brought historic legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, laws that dismantled segregation and protected the right to vote. Yet, racial injustice persisted, and frustrations continued to escalate in communities across America. The decade took a tragic turn in November 1963, when President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The nation mourned, and Lyndon B. Johnson assumed the presidency. Johnson pushed forward the Great Society, an ambitious agenda of social programs targeting poverty, education, healthcare, and civil rights. Medicare and Medicaid transformed access to healthcare for seniors and low-income families. Federal initiatives expanded early childhood education and assistance for disabled and marginalized communities. Though visionary in many respects, these programs unfolded alongside a growing conflict overseas that would soon overshadow domestic progress. The Vietnam War escalated rapidly under Johnson's leadership. What began as a limited advisory mission evolved into a massive military deployment. Hundreds of thousands of American soldiers entered the conflict, fighting in dense jungles, rural villages, and unfamiliar terrain. Televised news footage brought the war into American living rooms, revealing the harsh realities of combat and the suffering of civilians. As casualties rose and government statements failed to match on-the-ground conditions, public trust deteriorated. The anti-war movement grew into a powerful nationwide force. Students organized teach-ins, marches, and protests. Veterans returned home to speak against the conflict. Young men burned draft cards in defiance, and communities across the country questioned the moral justification for the war. The nation became more polarized than at any point since the Civil War. At the same time, cultural revolution was reshaping the American consciousness. The youth counterculture rejected traditional ideas about authority, conformity, gender roles, and the meaning of personal freedom. Communal living experiments challenged established norms of family and economics. Psychedelic art, avant-garde film, and new forms of literature expanded creative boundaries. The sexual revolution dismantled generations of silence and stigma surrounding intimate life. Recreational drug use, including marijuana and hallucinogens, became both a form of rebellion and a search for altered states of awareness. Music became the defining cultural engine of the 1960s. The Beatles revolutionized popular sound and style. Evolving from clean-cut pop icons to pioneers of experimental, boundary-breaking music. The Rolling Stones brought a darker, grittier energy that challenged polite society. Bob Dylan fused folk traditions with political commentary, creating anthems that became soundtracks for protest and social awakening. Jimi Hendrix pushed the limits of electric guitar, reinventing the possibilities of sonic expression, while Janis Joplin injected raw emotion and unfiltered power into rock performance. Motown reshaped American culture, with artists like the Supremes, Marvin Gaye, and Stevie Wonder bringing Black creative excellence to the mainstream. Soul music carried the voices of struggle, resilience, and pride. All of these musical forces culminated in the cultural explosion of Woodstock in 1969. Over 400,000 people gathered for 3 days of music, community, and countercultural solidarity. Woodstock was not simply a concert. It was a seismic cultural moment that defined a generation's values piece: love, rebellion, and the desire for a different future. Social movements extended far beyond youth culture. The feminist movement surged with new energy, challenging restrictive gender roles. Women demanded equal access to education, fair employment opportunities, reproductive freedom, and representation in public decision-making. The founding of the National Organization for Women in 1966 created a national network dedicated to women's rights. These efforts laid critical groundwork for future advances in gender equality. Other communities also rose to demand change. The Chicano movement gained momentum in the Southwest and California, where Mexican-American activists confronted segregation, farm worker exploitation, and educational inequality. Cesar Chavez and Dol Ores. Huerta led the United Farm Workers in strikes and boycotts that awakened the nation to the harsh conditions endured by agricultural laborers. Student walkouts demanded fair treatment, bilingual education, and representation. The movement strengthened cultural pride and reinforced political power in Mexican-American communities. Asian American activism expanded as communities confronted discriminatory housing practices, employment barriers, and racist stereotypes. College students called for ethnic studies programs that reflected their identities and histories. Diverse Asian communities, Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Korean, and more began uniting under a shared political identity for the first time. This collective action marked the birth of the modern Asian American movement. Native American activism also intensified. The American Indian movement formed in 1968 to confront police violence, poverty, and broken treaty obligations. In 1969, Native activists occupied Alcatraz Island, asserting that abandoned federal land should be returned to Native peoples under the terms of historic agreements. The occupation ignited national attention, highlighting centuries of mistreatment and demanding sovereignty, dignity, and recognition. These movements reflected a broader push for justice across the country, expanding the struggle beyond a single group into a truly multicultural transformation. Yet the late 1960s were also defined by sorrow. The assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 devastated millions and sparked uprisings in cities across America. His death underscored the fragility of progress and the persistence of hatred. 2 months later, Senator Robert Kennedy, emerging leader in civil rights and an outspoken critic of the Vietnam War, was assassinated during his presidential campaign. These tragedies shook the nation's confidence and deepened its sense of crisis. Political tension reached its peak later that year at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Thousands of anti-war demonstrators clashed with police in violent scenes broadcast live across the country. The chaos symbolized a nation in turmoil, caught between demands for change and fears of disorder. In the 1968 election, Richard Nixon capitalized on this unrest, promising law and order and a path to end the Vietnam War. His victory signaled a shift in the political landscape and marked the end of the decade's reformist momentum. Despite the turmoil, the decade closed with one of humanity's most extraordinary achievements. On July 20, 1969, millions watched as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first humans to set foot on the moon. Armstrong's words, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," echoed across the world, offering a moment of unity and hope amid a deeply divided era. The lunar landing demonstrated the heights America could reach when driven by vision, determination, and collaboration. By 1970, the United States had emerged from the 1960s irrevocably transformed. The civil rights movement had dismantled legal segregation and expanded democratic participation. The youth counterculture had revolutionized music, art, fashion, and social values. Feminism had challenged traditional gender roles and opened new possibilities for women. Chicano, Asian American, and Native American activism had forged new political identities and demanded long overdue justice. The Vietnam War had reshaped foreign policy debates and eroded trust in government. The space program had expanded humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. The 1960s was a crucible that tested the nation's character. It was a decade of conflict and courage, of loss and discovery, of rebellion and reimagining. Its legacy remains embedded in American society, influencing culture, politics, and identity for generations. The struggles and triumphs of this era continue to echo today, reminding us that progress is never simple, but always possible when people rise to demand a better future. The 1960s in America was a decade defined by conflict, creativity, and transformation. It was a period when the nation confronted its deepest inequalities, expanded its scientific ambitions, and reimagined its identity. The decade began with a sense of optimism and forward momentum. John F. Kennedy's election in 1960 represented youth, energy, and the promise of a new era. His administration promoted public service, global engagement, and bold scientific goals. Kennedy's call to land a man on the moon before the end of the decade captured the imagination of millions and set the country on a path to unparalleled technological achievement. Yet, beneath this spirit of hope, the nation faced profound internal struggles. The civil rights movement surged to the forefront of national attention as African Americans demanded equality and the dismantling of institutional racism. Sit-ins, freedom rides, and mass demonstrations challenged segregation in the South. Televised brutality against peaceful protesters in Birmingham shocked the nation and forced Americans to confront the harsh reality of Jim Crow. In 1963, the March on Washington gathered hundreds of thousands in a historic call for justice, culminating in Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s legendary "I Have a Dream" speech. Despite legislative victories, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, racial injustice persisted, and the struggle for true equality continued. In November 1963, The assassination of President Kennedy shattered the nation's sense of stability. Lyndon B. Johnson assumed the presidency and pushed forward the Great Society, an ambitious set of programs aimed at eliminating poverty, improving education, providing health care, and expanding civil rights. Medicare and Medicaid redefined access to health care. Federal education and housing reforms targeted systemic inequality. But even as Johnson advanced transformative domestic policies, a conflict overseas began consuming the nation's resources and dividing its people. The Vietnam War escalated rapidly. Ground troops surged into Southeast Asia, and combat operations intensified. Televised images of firefights, bombed villages, and civilian suffering eroded public trust in government assurances of progress. Anti-war sentiment grew swiftly. Students held teach-ins, protesters marched in the streets, and draft resistance spread across the country. Veterans returning home spoke out against the war, fueling further unrest. The conflict became a defining fracture in American society, pitting generations, political parties, and communities against one another. During this turmoil, a cultural revolution was reshaping American life. The youth counterculture rejected conventional norms, embraced new forms of expression, and sought alternative understandings of identity, spirituality, and freedom. Communal living experiments challenged traditional family structures. Psychedelic art and literature broke aesthetic boundaries. The sexual revolution broadened conversations about intimacy and personal autonomy. Recreational drug use, especially marijuana and LSD, became symbols of rebellion and self-exploration. Music became the heartbeat of a generation. The Beatles transformed popular sound and style, evolving from pop icons to pioneers of experimental music. The Rolling Stones introduced a gritty, rebellious energy that rejected polite society. Bob Dylan fused poetry with political commentary, giving voice to anti-war sentiment and civil unrest. Jimi Hendrix reinvented what an electric guitar could do, while Janis Joplin's raw emotional power challenged norms of performance and gender. Motown elevated black artistry to new heights, with acts like the Supremes, Marvin Gaye, and Stevie Wonder defining the sound of the era. The cultural climax came at Woodstock in 1969, where hundreds of thousands gathered in a symbolic celebration of peace, music, and a radically different vision of American life. Alongside the civil rights struggle and youth counterculture, other communities fought for justice. The feminist movement gained momentum as women demanded equal employment, educational opportunities, reproductive rights, and representation. The publication of The Feminine Mystique exposed the limitations placed on women and inspired new activism. The National Organization for Women formed in 1966 to coordinate national efforts for gender equality. Mexican-American communities, especially across the Southwest, launched the Chicano movement. Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta led the United Farm Workers in strikes and nationwide boycotts that exposed the harsh conditions faced by agricultural laborers. Student walkouts demanded educational fairness, bilingual programs, and an end to discriminatory practices. Cultural pride and political empowerment defined the movement's impact. Asian American activism grew rapidly during the late 1960s. Diverse Asian communities, historically separated by national origin, united to challenge housing discrimination, employment barriers, and racist stereotypes. Students demanded ethnic studies, programs, and representation. This era marked the formation of a modern, collective Asian American political identity. Native American communities intensified demands for sovereignty, treaty rights, and self-determination. In 1968, the American Indian movement was founded to combat police violence and systemic inequality. In 1969, Native activists occupied Alcatraz Island, asserting that unused federal land should be returned to Native peoples under treaty law. The occupation captured national attention and amplified indigenous demands for justice, dignity, and recognition. Despite the energy of social reform movements, the decade's final years were marked by devastating tragedy. In 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, plunging the nation into grief and sparking uprisings in cities across the country. 2 months later, Senator Robert Kennedy, an emerging champion of civil rights and opponent of the Vietnam War, was assassinated during his presidential campaign. These shocks deepened a sense of crisis and uncertainty. Political tensions erupted that summer during the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Anti-war protesters clashed violently with police while television cameras captured every moment. The scene symbolized a nation at war with itself. In the 1968 presidential election, Richard Nixon capitalized on the demand for order and stability, promising to restore calm and pursue peace with honor in Vietnam. His victory marked a political turning point and a shift away from the reform-driven momentum of the early decade. Amid all the turmoil, the 1960s produced one of humanity's greatest achievements, the race to the moon, the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union symbolized not only technological ambition, but ideological competition. The early years were dominated by Soviet successes, including Yuri Gagarin becoming the first human in space. The United States responded with the Mercury and Gemini missions, which refined techniques essential for lunar travel, orbital maneuvering, docking, endurance, and spacewalks. In 1968, Apollo 8 became the first spacecraft to orbit the moon, offering humanity its first view of Earth rising above the lunar surface. And on July 20, 1969, the Apollo 11 mission fulfilled Kennedy's bold promise. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon, while Michael Collins orbited above. Armstrong's first steps were watched by millions around the world. His words, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," captured the triumph of the decade's scientific aspirations and demonstrated what a determined nation could achieve. As the decade came to a close, the United States stood transformed. Civil rights activism had dismantled legal segregation and expanded democratic participation. Anti-war movements permanently altered public skepticism toward government and foreign intervention. The counterculture revolution redefined art, music, lifestyle, and social values. Feminism, Chicano activism, Asian American organizing, and Native American resistance reshaped the nation's understanding of equality. And the Apollo moon landing expanded humanity's sense of possibility. The 1960s left a legacy of courage, protest, innovation, and imagination. It was a decade of conflict and creativity, a time when ordinary people reshaped the country through extraordinary action. Its impact continues to resonate, influencing American culture, politics, identity, and vision well into the future. In the sweeping arc of American history, no decade transformed the nation more dramatically than the 1960s. It was a time of rising hope and deep division, a moment when ordinary citizens challenged long-standing institutions, and when the United States found itself confronting questions about identity, justice, war, and the future. This is the story of a nation caught between profound optimism and profound unrest, navigating a decade that would reshape every aspect of American life. The decade began with a sense of promise. In January 1961, a young, charismatic president named John F. Kennedy stood before the nation and declared that the torch had been passed to a new generation. His message was one of renewal, the belief that America could lead the world through courage, intellect, and moral conviction. It was a moment that captivated millions, giving rise to what would later be known as Camelot, a symbol of idealism and national confidence. Yet beneath the optimism lay pressing questions: the struggle for civil rights, fears of nuclear war, and growing concerns over American involvement abroad. The civil rights movement was already gaining momentum as the decade began. African Americans across the South demanded the most basic of rights: the right to vote, to be treated equally under the law, and to live without fear of segregationist violence. Activists organized sit-ins at lunch counters, freedom rides on interstate buses, and mass marches to pressure the federal government to intervene. Their courage shook the conscience of the nation. Television cameras captured the brutality inflicted upon peaceful protesters. Fire hoses, attack dogs, beaten marchers, and jailed students. These images forced America to confront truths that had long been ignored. In 1963, the movement reached a turning point with the March on Washington. Hundreds of thousands gathered at the Lincoln Memorial, joining together under one shared demand: freedom and equality. It was there that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered one of the most iconic speeches in American history, calling on the nation to live out the true meaning of its creed. But the victory was short-lived. Just months later, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, plunging the country into grief and uncertainty. His death marked not only the loss of a leader, but the loss of innocence for a generation that had believed so deeply in the promise of reform. Under President Lyndon B. Johnson, the struggle for civil rights pushed forward. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 became landmark achievements, dismantling legal segregation and protecting the right to vote across the South. Yet legislation could not erase centuries of inequality. Protests expanded beyond the South to northern cities, where African Americans faced unemployment, poor housing, and systemic discrimination. Urban uprisings erupted in Watts, Newark, Detroit, and across dozens of cities. The movement itself began to fracture as younger activists grew impatient with nonviolence and demanded more radical change. What had begun as a unified struggle evolved into a broader and more contentious debate about the direction of Black America. At the same time, a very different movement was sweeping across college campuses. Young Americans, frustrated with conformity, materialism, and the rigid social norms of their parents, began questioning authority in all its forms. This youth movement gave birth to a new counterculture. Students organized against the Vietnam War, protested for academic freedom, and challenged the power of institutions they believed were outdated and unjust. Music, art, and fashion became tools of rebellion. Long hair, colorful clothing, folk songs, and psychedelic rock embodied a cultural revolution that rejected tradition and embraced personal freedom. The counterculture found its spiritual center in places like San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district, where thousands gathered in search of community and experimentation. When the Woodstock Music Festival took place in 1969, it became a defining symbol of the era, a peaceful gathering of young people united by music, hope, and resistance to the mainstream values of the time. But beneath the surface of celebration lay deeper tensions, divided families, clashing generations, and a society struggling to define its moral boundaries. As cultural battles intensified at home, the United States became increasingly entangled in a war halfway around the world. American involvement in Vietnam escalated rapidly under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. What began as a limited advisory mission grew into a massive military commitment. By the late 1960s, hundreds of thousands of American troops were fighting in dense jungles against a determined enemy. The war demanded enormous sacrifices from young Americans, many of whom were drafted with little choice. For the first time, television brought the battlefield into living rooms across the country. The public saw graphic images of combat, casualties, and destruction in South Vietnamese villages. The longer the war continued, the more support eroded. The Tet Offensive in early 1968 marked a turning point. Although the United States repelled the attacks militarily, the scale and shock of the offensive contradicted government claims that victory was near. Public trust in political leaders collapsed. Anti-war protests grew larger and more confrontational. College campuses erupted in demonstrations, draft boards were stormed, and clashes with police became increasingly common. For millions of Americans, Vietnam was no longer a distant conflict. It was the defining crisis of the decade. Meanwhile, the struggle for gender equality gained new momentum. Women across the country demanded access to careers, education, and opportunities traditionally dominated by men. Influential texts like The Feminine Mystique questioned the assumption that a woman's place was exclusively in the home. Feminist activists organized protests, challenged workplace discrimination, and campaigned for reproductive rights. Though the movement was still in its early stages, it laid the foundation for dramatic changes that would unfold in the decades to come. Amid these sweeping social movements, American politics underwent profound upheaval. The Democratic Party became divided over civil rights and the war. President Johnson, overwhelmed by protests and political pressure, announced that he would not seek re-election. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in April 1968 triggered nationwide grief and widespread unrest in more than 100 cities. Just 2 months later, the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, another powerful voice for reform, deepened the nation's sense of despair. The 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago descended into chaos. As party leaders struggled to choose a nominee, thousands of anti-war protesters demonstrated outside too. Police responded with tear gas and force, images of which broadcast live to the country. The scenes shocked viewers and symbolized a nation fracturing under the weight of its own conflicts. When Richard Nixon won the presidency later that year on a promise to restore law and order, America had clearly entered a new political era. Yet even in the midst of turmoil, the decade ended with a moment of breathtaking achievement. In July 1969, the world watched as Apollo 11 carried astronauts to the moon. When Neil Armstrong took his first steps on the lunar surface, millions witnessed an accomplishment that transcended politics and conflict. For a brief moment, Americans were united by a shared sense of possibility. The moon landing served as a reminder that even during periods of intense division, the nation remained capable of extraordinary innovation. Still, as the 1960s came to a close, the legacy of the decade was deeply complex. The civil rights movement had dismantled segregation, but racial equality remained far from realized. The counterculture had transformed music, art, and personal freedom, yet left a trail of cultural tension in its wake. The feminist movement had begun reshaping gender roles, but full equality was still decades away. The Vietnam War continued to cast a long shadow, claiming American and Vietnamese lives long after the decade ended. And political polarization, once unimaginable, became a central feature of American democracy. The 1960s were not simply a decade of events. They were a turning point in the nation's identity. Americans confronted difficult questions about justice, responsibility, and the meaning of freedom. They debated what role the United States should play on the global stage and how power should be distributed at home. They challenged long-standing assumptions and demanded to be heard. The conflicts of the era produced pain, loss, and division. But they also sparked profound reforms that reshaped law, culture, and society. Today, the legacy of the 1960s remains visible everywhere. Movements for civil rights, gender equality, and social justice continue the work begun more than half a century ago. Political debates trace their roots to the divisions of that era. Cultural trends from music to activism to youth identities still draw inspiration from the decade's spirit of rebellion. And the questions raised during that turbulent period continue to shape America's national conversation. The 1960s were a time of revolution, culture, and crisis, a decade of dreams and disillusionment, triumph and tragedy. Above all, it was a decade that forced America to confront itself and decide what kind of nation it wanted to become. Its lessons remain as urgent today as they were then. That freedom demands vigilance, that progress requires struggle, and that the course of history is shaped not only by leaders but by the courage of ordinary people willing to demand change.